We are indeed glad to have Dr. Peter Gillis come and speak with us. So, Peter, welcome to the Bible Forum. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Today I'm going to talk about some new research. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to tell you, we didn't know until 2003. I see here, 2003? It took us 2,000 years to get around to this? Yep. John Lennox, mathematics professor at Faith is not a leap in the dark. It is the exact opposite. It is a commitment based on evidence. It is irrational to reduce all faith to blind faith and then subject it to ridicule. That provides a very anti-intellectual and convenient way of avoiding intelligent discussion. So I would like to drive the intelligent discussion here. Now, you see up here on this thing, I've got some names. Can you in the back, can you read them? Can you make them out, sort of? Can you see that they're letters? If you can kind of see their letters, it's Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, John, Jesus, Ananias, Jonathan, Matthew, Menahem, and James. So the first three or four are Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, and Judas. Okay? We're going to be looking at names. University of Florida article in the Current Directions in Psychological Science, quote, "The ability to learn and remember proper names," so Peter, Howard, Winston, particularly people's names, is notoriously more difficult relative to other types of words. It's very hard to remember because they're meaningless in a way. My name means stone, but you don't look at me and think, stone. You know, I could be called Paul, or I could be called any number of different names. The fact that my name is Peter is to a stranger who meets me pretty meaningless. The American Indians got around this. This is from a quote from a book by Patricia Griggs, talking about the names that these American Indians were giving each other. And the quote is, "Running Eagle?" She puzzled, frowning at him. "What's wrong with the name Running Eagle?" He murmured, "Running Eagle, too stupid to fly." Now, you may be applying Running Eagle to somebody you already know right now. You know, if you considered me a rather stupid person and you had Running Eagle, you'd never forget my name, would you? But we don't have names like that. So names are very, very difficult to get right. Names, context, and that sort of thing. Bart Ehrman, who I will be picking apart in a couple of weeks, this is from his book, Jesus Interrupted. What do you suppose happened to the stories about Jesus over the years as they were told and retold, not as disinterested news stories by eyewitnesses, but as propaganda meant to convert people to faith? Told by people who had themselves heard them fifth or sixth or 19th hand. Did you or your kids ever play the telephone game at a birthday party? Now, why the telephone game is relevant here, I'm not really sure. You know the telephone game where you're in a circle or in a line and you can only whisper to the person next to you. You can only whisper the message to the person next to you, and you can only do it once, and you can only hear it from one person, and you've got to take all that and you've got to whisper it to the next person, and it gets all the way around, and it's completely different. It has no relationship whatsoever. Why this is a relevant example, I don't know, but we will see that in some ways he might be right. The point is that most words are difficult to learn, and the facts are hard to get right if you weren't there or you're not talking to an eyewitness who was there. Now, so the gospel writers have to get the names right. So in a way, you know, you're trying to do something difficult, so you tie one arm behind your back and you say, I can still do this. Well, actually, we've got to kind of tie two arms behind our back because the Gospels weren't written in the place that they are writing about. Whether you are a Christian, so the traditional location of the writing of these things, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was in Syria, Asia Minor. St. Jerome says Judea for Matthew, but any closer than that. It doesn't get any closer than that to Israel. It was written outside of the place it was writing about. And this is colossally difficult. So you think about things like they've got to and then this is why today I narrowed today down to names, because the research that I'm actually quoting has looked into things like botany, agriculture, social class. You've got to get all of it right. You imagine how someone from Texas writing about Peru, Indiana, having never been here, you would spot it immediately, wouldn't you? They would have no idea where the fire station was. They would have no idea where the churches were, or what had been torn down, or what kind of trees grew here, you know? So these are very, very difficult things. If you can show that indeed these Gospels reflect exactly what was going on there, that would give you a lot more credibility, wouldn't it? So I decided to play a game with my friends and family in the United States, and I decided, well, let's see if we can do it. So I WhatsApped a number of friends and family, and I said, here's the scenario. Think that you're going to write a story. It's a story about some people in Germany, in Berlin, Germany. Now, most of us may not have been to Berlin, Germany, but you have some idea. Germany, it's in the middle of Europe. There was a war there, and Berlin's the capital. We kind of have an idea of it. We're not totally unfamiliar with Germany. The scenario goes like this. One group of men is meeting another group of men. So a group of friends is meeting another group of friends. What are the names of the friends? This is what I got. Franz, Hans, Christoph, Friedrich, Dieter, Rolf, Joseph, Sigrid, Hans, Frederick, Wessel, Greta, Helmut, Max, Pauline, Winnie, Stefan, Raoul, Georg, George, Kurt, Werner, Dieter, Hugo, Helmut, Adolf, he had to be in there someplace, Bernard, Fabian, Walter, Karl, and Ralph. So they came out. And it kind of sounds German, doesn't it? All those things. They sound pretty German, don't they? If we compare those to the most popular names in Germany, Karl, Wilhelm, Heinrich, Hans, Otto, Hermann, Paul, Walter, Friedrich, Ernst, you think, oh, yeah, they're close. Those were the most popular names in 1900. If we compare them to the names, so this is 2016. Now the friends are getting together in Berlin in 2016. What are their names? The overlap with the experiment, I think 5 people did this. 2 in the United States, 3 in the United States, and 2 in the Netherlands. Now remember, the Netherlands, we are next door. We speak a Germanic language. 60% of our GDP comes from Germany. All our cheese goes to Germany, okay? So I did this also with Dutch people. The overlap between all those names I just said, and there are 33 names. How many of those 33 names appear in the top 10 names of 1995? So we're assuming these are people are sort of 25, 30 years old. How many do you think? What's the overlap with those top 10? A big fat goose egg. 0. It's hard to do. It's hard for you to do because you think, well, I'm in America. I have an excuse. I don't know all those names. But we're in the Netherlands, and it's still absolutely 0. The top 10 names. So if you went to a university, for example, and you said, give me a list of all your 10,000 students. I just want the guys. Number 1, Maximilian, Philip, Florian, Felix, Paul, Lucas, Alexander, Sebastian, Kevin, and Tobias. Those are German names. Yes, those are the most popular German names. When I teach in my programs and I have German students, those are their names. So I can confirm that these are exactly what you would say. But it's hard to do. And if you don't know about it, if you're not there, if you can't do that research, you would never know. Unless you actually were from that place and you saw these people and you knew their names and you put them in our case, in the Gospels. So the experiment shows, and by the way, you can't go and get a PhD with this little experiment here. But it is instructive. It gives an idea of just how difficult that is. So we didn't do very well. How do other people do? I was talking with a very learned man. He's a professor at the university where I teach. And we started talking about the things that he didn't like about the United States. He said, oh, they're always pushing their religion on you. Here I am with my Jesus bracelet on. And I said, well, okay. I said, so that's not very nice. He said, no. He said, all of these things, these Gospels, they were written hundreds of years later. You hear that. If you go out and do what I told you to do and listen to these atheists, they'll say, oh, it was written hundreds of years later. It started out that Jesus was a prophet, sort of, but then he was a prophet, and then he was a pretty special prophet, and then he did healing. I mean, he was a prophet that could heal. That's about where the Muslims stop, and then he got crucified, which was a real inconvenience, but to get people to follow him, we had to say, well, he was sort of the Son of God-ish, and then he was the Son of God, and then he was absolutely God. Because we had to embellish this as we went along. Otherwise, why would people willingly go hang on crosses and be burned alive by Romans or eaten by lions in the forum? It doesn't hold water very well, but that's the logic. Well, let's look at some Gospels, apocryphal Gospels. You may have heard of these, the Gospel of Philip, Thomas, Mary, Judas, Peter. There are a number of these Gospels out there that we do know were written a couple hundred years after Christ. The Gospel of Thomas, it does seem that whoever wrote the Gospel of Thomas had played the telephone game, because the lead character in the Gospel of Thomas is Didymus, Judas, Thomas. All three of those together. So you have Didymus and you have Thomas, and that was the twin, and then Judas is thrown in there, and it's a jumble of things. Didymus, Judas, Thomas, James the Just. Well, James is up here. It's number 11. Simon Peter, that's pretty good. Jesus, good. Matthew, Thomas, Mary, and Salome. That's not bad. That's not bad. Probably written pretty close to that time. The Gospel of Mary has the Savior. They don't talk about who the Savior is. Peter, Mary, Andrew, and Levi. The Gospel of Judas has Judas, Jesus, and in the words of Dr. Peter Williams at Tyndale College, Cambridge, a bunch of people from outer space. Well, they do call them heavenly figures, but Barbelo, Sophia, Nebro, Sakalaset, Galila, Yobel, Adam, Eve, Zoe, Michael, and Gabriel. These are all these heavenly figures or people from outer space. That's how well they do. And the overlap is not very good. If you go into the other apocryphal Gospels, it's even less. Oh dear. How do the Dead Sea Scrolls do? So when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and we go through the names that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, how do they compare to this? Now, this is the most popular Jewish names of Palestinian Jews between about 300 BC and 200 AD. One interesting thing, just an aside, when I was researching a lot of stuff on names, as you can imagine, and what you see is a constancy of names over hundreds of years, and then the 20th century comes. And it goes from sort of, so here's the name, I don't know, Mary. And Mary goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 3 to 2 to 1. And it kind of looks like a little mountain range. But it stays there. But they're all pretty constant, staying within a bandwidth. And you get to the 20th century, and there's a flood of new names. And it looks like spaghetti thrown up. It doesn't have this kind of undulation. It's all over the place. Things just dropping out completely. So between 300 BC and 200 AD, you have a pretty constant types of names among Palestinian Jews. How did the Dead Sea Scrolls do? I mean, can we trust these things? The number one name in the Dead Sea Scrolls is Simon. The number 2 name in the Dead Sea Scrolls is Joseph. The number 3 name in the Dead Sea Scrolls is Lazarus. And it goes on all the way down. Oh, okay, wow, that's pretty good. We can, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can look at those and we can say, oh, that's pretty good. And you got the right names and all that kind of stuff. We might be able to trust those. Ossuaries. Now, when you died in the time of Jesus and they put you in a tomb and your flesh would rot away and there would only be bones left, and they would put you in a bone box. This is much more convenient. It was called an ossuary. We have found a lot of ossuaries, and they've got a name on them. Almost all of them. Just as an aside, it's been in the last, I think, decade, maybe 15 years, where we have found the bone box. Remember Caiaphas, the high priest that presided over the trial of Jesus? Caiaphas doesn't kind of make the top 20 here, okay? Caiaphas, they found his bone box, the bone box of the high priest. Oh, they made it all up, yeah. We found the bone box of the high priest. Well, how do you know that? Well, it says Caiaphas on it. And it was a bone box with the kind of ornamentation that would be associated with someone of that status. Yeah. So the Jewish and atheistic archaeologists that have found this are themselves saying that this is not a bunch of Christians, sort of hopping up and down saying, oh, look what we found. No, this is hard science. So in the ossuaries, the number 1 name is Simon. Number 2 is Joseph. Number 3 is Judas, and number 4 is Lazarus. Wow. But of course you would think that, if you find a bunch of coffins and they got names on them, you would say, well, that should be a nice slice through the population, and you would expect that. So the Dead Sea Scrolls match with all the other names that they've got, plus the ossuaries. Okay. Josephus, Jewish, Roman, originally Jewish, but a Roman historian, a micro-historian. He wrote tons and tons of stuff. They even kind of made fun of him for being so detailed as he was. Number 1 name in Josephus was Simon. The number 2 name in Josephus is Joseph. The number 3 name in Josephus is Lazarus. Aha, so this also gives us reason to believe in what Josephus is telling us as a historian about this time. Well, okay, now we have to get around to the New Testament. And does the New Testament live up to this? In other words, does the New Testament... Now, remember, this is before the internet. Yeah? This is before... Sometimes you have to, just make it clear. This is before the internet. There was no way to go out and see what the names were. How does the New Testament get this? Does the New Testament get it right? The number 1 name in the New Testament Gospels is Simon. Number 2 is Joseph. Number 3, tied for number 3 is Judas and John. So the same pattern holds true across the bone boxes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a reliable historian of the period, and the Gospels that you've got in the book between your 2 hands here. That's how reliable it is. This is not a statistical anomaly. Yeah? You can't do this unless you were there or writing a story about someone who was there. You would never get all the names. Because Simon is not just Simon Peter. There are 6 or 7 Simons in the Gospels. One that comes to mind is Simon of Cyrene, who helped Christ carry the cross, or at least part of the cross. Okay, Well, there are a couple other things to get right here. So we got the names right. That's pretty amazing. So this is more from a literary side. What is the principal character called in the narrative? But this is really, really important. The principal character in the Christian accounts, in the Gospels, is called Jesus. No big surprise. Matthew mentions Jesus 150 times. Mark, about 80. Luke, about 90. John, about 240 times mentions Jesus. Gospel of Thomas gets it 100 times. The Gospel of Philip and Judas, somewhere around 25. Peter and Mary don't mention Jesus at all. So when you go to the apocryphal Gospels, all the statistics go down like this. There's such a clear dividing line between them. If you go to Paul, he uses Christ more than Jesus by about 2 or 3 to 1. You see, what happened around AD 50 was that people who were writing about Jesus used Christ almost exclusively. John would be an exception to this, obviously. But the people who are writing about Christ, or Jesus, use Christ almost exclusively. So anything after AD 50 that came back, so you can't say that these, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you wouldn't write it that way if you were writing it 150 or 200 years later. Paul starts to go over to using Christ. Jesus' name in non-Christian accounts does exactly the same thing. Tacitus, an early first century historian, uses the word Christians and Christus. Pliny, in his letters, uses Christians and Christus. Josephus, Jesus who was called Christ. Early, Jesus is used. Christ quickly became, in the words of Peter Williams, so common that most texts after AD 50 only use Christ. So it's another way, it's a sort of a triangulation of things. They got the names right. They got the timing of the names right as well. And the last main point, what does the principal character call himself? Jesus calls himself a very odd thing. His speech is different. And he has no teaching. This is very important when looking at these kinds of things. It's a bit of a pointy-headed detail, but there's no teaching on Gentile inclusion. There are some shadows of it, being the light to the world and that kind of thing. But there's no teaching on Gentile inclusion. There's no teaching on church order. What was the biggest thing at the end of the 2nd century in the church? Who had the power? Who were the bishops and the archbishops and all that kind of thing? If they had been writing it then, they would have been writing it about those things. They would have been writing it about the things that were most important to them, not going back a couple of 100 years in the past to figure out what were the names that we used then, what was the botany of Palestine like, and then trying to write a gospel, let alone 4 gospels that overlap with each other. Parables. Paul doesn't use parables. Jesus uses parables. The early church didn't take to parables. They didn't use parables in their teachings. So parables are another reason to say, hey, this is from that context in that time. And Jesus' favorite self-designation is the Son of Man. So it's always on Jesus' lips. He is the Son of Man. No one else refers to him that way. There are some exceptions in Acts, Hebrews, and Revelation when they're talking about pre-tribulation visions of Christ. Son of Man does come in. But only in that context. For the rest of Scripture and for the rest of the writings around it, Son of Man doesn't come back at all. So, and also not in the Gospels of Mary and Peter and Judas and Thomas and all those things. You see it not at all. So, to sum up, what do you need to go tell people when you walk out of here? Yeah. Well, the Gospels, so one of my arms behind my back, the Gospels were not written in Israel. And we've already seen how difficult it is just to get the names right, even if you're a neighbor, like the Netherlands is a neighbor of Germany. It's hard to get the names right, but they're perfectly right. And we know now these distributions. This is a big deal. This distribution here, and anybody wants the documentation, all the stuff, please take it. This is a big deal. This is hard stuff to get hold of. Names are the hardest things to get right. This morning, we were sitting in the back, and Sarah came in, and Peter said, well, this is Sarah. And why was he helping me with the name of someone that I hadn't seen in 2 years? Because we all know it's hard to remember names. We don't get them right. The apocryphal Gospels don't get them. Why aren't they in the Bible too? They didn't get the facts right. They didn't get their facts right. They are junk. The ones that say that Jesus had a wife and all this, actually it doesn't say that, but people see Jesus on the same page as wife and think, hey. The four canonical Gospels get the right names in the right places, in the right proportion, not to mention the things I didn't cover today about agriculture and all these, when feeding the 5,000, they sat down on this kind of lush grass, and you say, how do they know it was lush grass? How can you prove that? And they can say, look at the weather patterns, and you say, hey, actually, at that point, the grass would have been very long, it was the rainy season, it was very lush. Wow, what a detail. You can't get that detail if you're not talking to eyewitnesses. So the way Jesus talked and taught, taunted and triumphed, is unique to his ministry. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. No one else does. He uses parables. Early church didn't do it, so they wouldn't have been writing in parables. And he talks nothing about the church issues that were to come. So no one made the Gospels later. You've got it. You've got credible eyewitness testimony, which is the very, very hardest thing. I don't have to tell you. It's the hardest thing. We don't know what we saw. We can't remember. And you've got it here. And it's not a statistical blip. In other words, there was no telephone game. If the Gospels got the hardest details right, the most difficult details, what are the chances that they got all the other details right as well? Thank you.